In medieval Europe, sex wasn't private. It wasn't sacred either, not in the way we might think. It was regulated, scrutinized, and turned into a weapon of control by the Catholic Church. From the highest noble to the lowest peasant, your sex life wasn't your own. It belonged to God, and the priests claimed to speak for him. By the 11th century, church leaders issued manuals called penitentials, step-by-step guides for confessors to interrogate every detail of a couple's bedroom habits. These weren't vague moral teachings, they were graphic lists of prohibited acts. Missionary position, acceptable, anything else, sin, sex standing up, sin, woman on top, grave sin because it inverted the natural order of man's dominance. Anal or oral sex, even within marriage, was punishable by weeks of fasting or public penance. It got worse. Certain days were off limits for sex: Sundays, feast days, Fridays, Wednesdays, the entirety of Lent and Advent. If you did the math, nearly half the calendar year was forbidden. A married couple that broke these rules was said to risk not just damnation, but physical deformities in their offspring. Priests taught that children conceived during unclean periods might be born with disabilities as divine punishment. Some confessors asked chillingly intimate questions. Did you kiss your wife during intercourse? Did you look at her naked body? Did you enjoy it too much? That too was a sin. Lust within marriage was still lust, and lust was deadly. If a husband found his wife too attractive and burned with passion, he was to repent. Medieval theology treated sex as a dirty duty meant only for procreation, never for pleasure. Failure to comply carried consequences. A woman accused of being too willing in bed could be flogged. Men accused of spilling seed outside their wives' bodies could face public shaming, even excommunication. And priests didn't just lecture, they spied. In some villages, priests had the legal right to question newlyweds on whether their marriage had been consummated properly. If not, they could be forcibly separated. This wasn't just about morality, it was about control. By regulating something as primal as sex, the church exerted dominance over every household. It made people afraid of their own bodies, of desire, of intimacy. Couples weren't just making love, they were performing a ritual that could damn them forever if done wrong. But before we go deeper into this dark history, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments, because this is the kind of history they never taught in school. In medieval Europe, marriages weren't just private unions, they were political tools. And sometimes the stakes were so high that a couple's sex life became a matter for the entire court to inspect. Enter the congresses, or trial by congress. When a nobleman or monarch claimed his marriage wasn't consummated, the church had to investigate. Consummation was the key to making a marriage valid. No sex meant no binding contract, which meant political alliances could be broken without consequence. But how could anyone prove what happened, or didn't, inside the bedchamber? The solution was as bizarre as it was humiliating. The couple was ordered to perform intercourse in front of witnesses. Take the infamous case of Margaret of Valois in the late 16th century. She and her husband Henry of Navarre were ordered to prove their marriage by bedding each other before an audience of clergymen, physicians, and noblewomen. The curtains were drawn back just far enough for observers to see that penetration had taken place. If Henry failed to rise to the occasion, his manhood and his kingdom were in jeopardy. This wasn't an isolated event. In the 14th century, King Louis X's marriage to Margaret of Burgundy was annulled because witnesses claimed she mocked him in bed and refused to let him consummate the union. His inability to perform was considered a defect severe enough to dissolve a royal marriage. To save face, men sometimes endured public virility tests. Naked, they were examined and manipulated by doctors and priests to ensure their genitals were whole and sound. For commoners, the humiliation was no less severe. If a husband accused his wife of being barren, she might be forced to undergo a vaginal inspection by midwives appointed by the church. They checked for signs of virginity or obstruction, often using crude tools that caused pain and bleeding. If she protested, it was taken as proof of guilt. In some annulment cases, husbands claimed maleficium, that their penises had been magically rendered impotent. The church took these claims seriously. Priests sprinkled holy water on the man's genitals, prayed for his virility, and sometimes prescribed intercourse in front of witnesses to prove whether the spell had been broken. None of this had anything to do with love. It was about property, inheritance, and power. A noblewoman's fertility wasn't her own concern. It was a matter of state. A man's ability to get an erection wasn't a private struggle. It could determine the fate of kingdoms. Imagine the shame, the fear, the utter loss of dignity. Couples weren't just examined, they were stripped of all privacy. Their most intimate acts became spectacles for others to judge. In the medieval mind, seeing too much of your spouse's body was a sin. Full nudity during sex wasn't romantic, it was considered dirty, an act fit only for beasts. Church leaders taught that God covered Adam and Eve for a reason. Modesty in the marital bed wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. By the 12th century, manuals for confessors explicitly warned against unnecessary exposure of the body. A husband who looked at his wife's nakedness was said to corrupt her soul and his own. Theologian Peter Damian wrote that even within marriage, lust contaminates the soul when the act is sought for pleasure and not for procreation. The rule was simple. When you had sex, you kept your clothes on, at least partially. Many couples wore a chemise, a long linen shirt with a hole cut just large enough to allow penetration. This modesty garment became a tool of piety, a barrier between sinful flesh and sanctified duty. Couples were instructed to do their business in silence, with no lights and as little physical contact as possible. Pleasure was dangerous. Any sign of desire, touching, kissing, or even prolonged eye contact was suspect. If a man admitted to enjoying the sight of his wife unclothed, confessors sometimes ordered him to fast or flog himself as penance. If a woman expressed enthusiasm, she risked being accused of lasciviousness. There were exceptions, but only for the powerful. Kings and nobles often ignored these restrictions, but the double standard was glaring. While a peasant woman could be whipped for unchaste behavior with her husband, a nobleman might parade his mistress naked through courtly banquets with no consequence. For most people, sex became an act of fear and obligation. It wasn't about connection or intimacy. It was about getting it over with before God noticed. The body itself was suspect. Flesh was weak, desire was sin, and even within marriage, you risked damnation every time you gave in. This was the world couples lived in, one where love and lust were enemies, and where nakedness, something natural, was turned into a mark of shame. In medieval Europe, a woman's worth often came down to one thing: whether her hymen was intact on her wedding night. Virginity wasn't just a moral ideal, it was a commodity, proof of family honor and a guarantee of untainted lineage. And the lengths people went to preserve or fake it were as brutal as they were bizarre. On the wedding night, many brides faced the blood sheet ritual. After intercourse, the bed sheets were inspected by family or servants for stains of blood, proof that the bride had been deflowered. If there was no blood, suspicion exploded. Was she a virgin at all? Had the groom been duped into marrying a damaged woman? In some households, failure to produce a blood-stained sheet led to annulments, public shaming, or worse. For some women, the pressure was deadly. In France and England, there are records of new husbands brutally forcing intercourse to ensure bleeding, sometimes tearing vaginal tissue intentionally if the act didn't draw blood. The pain and trauma of these tests were rarely discussed. It wasn't about love, it was about proof. Others turned to deception to survive. Midwives and apothecaries sold artificial hymens made from animal membranes or special mixtures of blood and herbs that could be inserted before the wedding night. Some concoctions used chicken blood, carefully applied to the sheets at the right moment. These tricks worked, sometimes, but if discovered, the woman could be accused of fraud and her family could be ruined. Virginity obsession went even further in some parts of Europe. In certain regions of Germany and Italy, there were virginity inspections for brides. Old women, often midwives, were appointed by local authorities to physically examine girls before marriage. The process was humiliating and invasive. Girls as young as 12 were subjected to these checks, their bodies treated like property. And yet, the hypocrisy was staggering. Men faced no such scrutiny. A groom's sexual history wasn't questioned. He could arrive at his wedding after years of visiting brothels or fathering illegitimate children, and no one cared. But if a bride's body failed this arbitrary test, she could lose everything. For women, virginity was a cage. It turned their bodies into battlegrounds where their value as humans was constantly weighed. These rituals weren't about purity or holiness. They were about control, property, and bloodlines, about keeping women in fear of their own sexuality. In the Middle Ages, your sex life wasn't just between you and your partner. It belonged to the community. If you broke the rules, even in private, you risked being dragged into the town square and made into an example. Adultery was one of the most common targets. In England and France, women accused of cheating could be paraded through the streets barefoot, wearing nothing but a shift, while neighbors hurled insults and garbage. In some cases, their heads were shaved as a permanent mark of shame. Husbands could demand their wives be flogged or even branded on the face. Men weren't immune, but their punishments were often lighter. A straying husband might pay a fine or spend a few nights in the stocks while villagers mocked him. Then there was fornication, sex before marriage. If caught, unmarried couples were made to perform humiliating penance. In German towns, they were sometimes forced to crawl naked through the streets while holding a candle, a priest trailing behind them, chanting prayers for their corrupt souls. Homosexuality brought even harsher consequences. In 14th century Florence, men accused of sodomy were executed by hanging or burned at the stake. Lesser offenses could mean castration. The same church that railed against sin used these punishments to terrify the population into obedience. Bestiality was treated with a unique blend of cruelty and absurdity. Not only was the human punished, but the animal was too. There are recorded cases where pigs, goats, and donkeys were dressed in human clothes and hanged for participating in the crime. In 1386, a sow in France was tried and publicly executed for allegedly mating with a man. Even within marriage, sexual misbehavior was policed. A husband who was too rough or engaged in unnatural acts could be excommunicated. A wife who was too enthusiastic could be accused of witchcraft, her passion taken as evidence that she'd made a pact with the devil. These punishments weren't just about enforcing morality, they were about power. Public shaming kept the community in line. Fear of exposure made people police each other. The message was clear: your body wasn't yours, your desire wasn't yours. Step out of line, and the whole world would watch you burn. In the Middle Ages, even animals weren't safe from the law. Bestiality, sex between humans and animals, was treated as both a crime and an affront to God. And when it was discovered, medieval justice lashed out at both parties. The human was executed, the animal was too. The Church believed that animals could become agents of sin, corrupted by human lust. This idea wasn't symbolic. It led to real trials where animals stood accused of unnatural acts. In 1386, a sow in Falaise, France, was tried for allegedly mating with a man and killing his child. The animal was dressed in human clothes, chained and brought to court. Witnesses testified against it. A public executioner was summoned. The verdict: guilty. The sow was hanged from a gallows in the town square. This wasn't an isolated incident. In 1494, in Sévigné, France, a man and a donkey were accused of fornication. Villagers testified that the donkey was a willing participant, but in this rare case, the donkey was acquitted after the local priest vouched for her good character and claimed she had always been a virtuous beast. The man, however, was burned alive. These trials followed a grim pattern. First, the accused man was arrested and tortured until he confessed. He was usually castrated or mutilated before being executed. Then the animal, goat, dog, or even chicken, was put on trial. Sometimes the creature was whipped or burned. Other times its body was displayed after death as a warning to others. To modern eyes, this seems insane. But in the medieval worldview, sin was contagious. A man who defiled an animal polluted the entire community. Killing the beast wasn't just punishment, it was a ritual cleansing. The hypocrisy was glaring. Nobles and kings often kept exotic animals as pets and symbols of power, and stories of their private debauchery rarely saw the light of day. But peasants caught in forbidden acts became scapegoats. Their lives ended in agony. Their names were erased. It wasn't about justice, it was about fear, control, and public spectacle. By punishing the animal alongside the human, authorities sent a message: no act, no matter how secret, was beyond their reach. In medieval Europe, confessions weren't earned, they were extracted. Accused of sexual sins like sodomy, adultery, or witchcraft, countless men and women were tortured until they said whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. The process wasn't about truth, it was about control. Once accused, the odds were against you. Inquisitors believed no one would admit to such crimes willingly, so they turned to pain. One common method was the strappado. Your hands were tied behind your back, a rope looped around your wrists, and you were hoisted into the air. Then they dropped you suddenly, jerking your arms from their sockets. Victims screamed, shoulders shattered, and many passed out before the questioning even began. There was the rack, where you were stretched until tendons tore, and the broadquin, where wooden boards were clamped around your legs and wedges hammered in until bones splintered. Some prisoners were subjected to water torture, a primitive form of waterboarding, where cloth was stuffed in their mouths and water poured over their faces until they choked and believed they were drowning. For those accused of witchcraft, sexual humiliation was part of the process. Women were often stripped naked so officials could search for the witch's mark, a mole, scar, or birthmark where Satan was said to have kissed them. Midwives were ordered to inspect their genitals for unnatural signs. Any blemish could be used as proof. Men accused of sodomy faced castration. In Florence, dozens of young men were rounded up in the 15th century and tortured until they confessed to acts with other men. Some were burned alive in public squares, others were whipped through the streets before being hanged. These weren't isolated events. Torture chambers existed across Europe, and church-sanctioned manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum gave detailed instructions on how to break a suspect's will. One passage bluntly stated, "Torture is to be continued so long as it appears that the truth has not been told." Most confessed just to end the pain. Many named others to stop their own suffering, dragging innocent neighbors into the same nightmare. Families were destroyed, communities turned on themselves. The point wasn't justice, it was to terrify the population into submission. Torture was a performance. It showed everyone watching that the body wasn't their own, that the church could twist it, break it, and burn it at will. Medieval Europe's bizarre sexual rules weren't accidents, they were tools of power. By dictating when, how, and with whom people could have sex, the church and state planted fear deep into daily life. That fear kept people obedient. Sex was made dirty, even inside marriage. Lust was demonized. Desire was a weakness, a crack where the devil could slip in. And since no one could perfectly follow the rules, everyone felt guilty. That guilt made them easier to control. Virginity was weaponized. Women became commodities, their bodies policed by fathers, brothers, and priests. A bride's failure to bleed on her wedding night could destroy her family's honor. Men weren't spared either. A husband's impotence wasn't just embarrassing, it could cost him his land and title. Torture ensured compliance. Confessions extracted under unimaginable pain filled court records with names and stories, real people reduced to examples. Public punishments reminded everyone watching your private acts were never really private. Even animals weren't safe. Executing beasts alongside humans wasn't about justice, it was a warning. If even a goat could be hanged for sex, what chance did you have? This wasn't about morality, it was about control. The church built a system where shame and fear governed bodies and minds. It wasn't enough to obey the law in public. You had to police your own thoughts in private, terrified that a slip would end in the stocks, the gallows, or the stake. And yet, the same men enforcing these rules often ignored them. Priests kept concubines. Kings fathered illegitimate children. Nobles visited brothels, while peasants were whipped for fornication. The rules weren't for everyone. They were for the powerless. What happened in the medieval bedroom wasn't just about sex. It was about power, punishment, and control, and for centuries it worked.